She was late for her night shift at the hospital, her phone battery blinking red as she jogged across cracked sidewalks. The air thick with smoke from the wildfires that never stopped these days. The buses were not running, and she had no money for a rideshare, so she ran past boarded up stores with broken windows, past tents clustered under the freeway where children with hollow eyes watched her pass past the murals of saints painted over graffiti, as if prayers could hold back the hunger. In the city, the sun was gone and the sky was a dark bruise when the wind changed direction, and she stopped in the middle of the crosswalk because the clouds above her were rolling back like black curtains, revealing something so wrong her breath caught in her throat. A crack of blue light split the sky open, and she saw a throne descending made of black metal covered in red glyphs, humming with a sound so deep it rattled the glass in the buildings as car alarms screamed. She stepped back, but people were running past her, some looking up with phones held high, filming the moment, others screaming, mothers clutching babies as they tripped over the curb. The throne settled above downtown Los Angeles, and the wind was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. She could hear her own heart thudding as the smoke cleared and she saw them stepping off the throne, tall figures with skin like obsidian and eyes that burned like coals, armored in dark purple plates with spikes along their shoulders. Each step they took cracked the pavement under their boots. She saw one raise his hand, and a line of humans lifted into the air, choking as their bodies twisted. She tasted bile in her mouth, but she could not move. Her feet were rooted to the ground as she watched the Galactic King descend from the center of the throne, taller than the others, wearing a crown that floated inches above his head. Spinning slowly, his eyes were red suns, and when he spoke, the words came out like metal grinding against metal. The people are mine now. The city belongs to the Galactic King. She saw him raise his hand again, and the hovering humans were dropped to the ground. Like broken dolls, the crowd screamed. Some fled, but others dropped to their knees with hands lifted as if worship might save them. The king stepped forward toward a woman clutching a child. The child was crying, the woman was screaming, but the king lifted his foot and kicked the woman across the street, her body flipping before it hit a parked car, and she stopped moving. The child kept crying, and she saw it all. She saw the king's eyes sweep over the crowd as if they were insects. She saw the woman who was kicked, lying limp with blood pooling around her head, and something in her snapped. She ran toward the child, her feet slamming the pavement, her lungs burning, her arms scooping the child up as the king's red eyes found her, and he raised his boot, and the world exploded in pain as her body hit the ground. She felt her ribs shatter as the world went dark, and her last thought was she would not let them take everything, not again, not while she could still breathe. She woke to the taste of blood in her mouth and the smell of burning plastic. The sky above her was pulsing with purple lightning, and the screams of people blended with the sound of engines rumbling in the air. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking, her ribs stabbing her with each breath. She saw the child she had tried to protect crawling toward her, tears streaking down his dirt-covered face, his small hands reaching for her. She pulled him into her arms even as her vision blurred. The Galactic King's soldiers were everywhere, their armor reflecting the purple glow as they dragged people out of buildings, lined them up in the street, forced them to kneel with cold barrels pressed to the backs of their heads. She saw a man try to run, and a soldier lifted a finger, and the man fell screaming, clutching at his eyes until he went silent. The Galactic King stood above them all, watching with a face that did not move, a crown that spun slowly above his head, his red eyes glowing brighter. Each time someone died, she held the child close, telling him to keep quiet, to breathe slowly, to be small enough that they would not see him. But her eyes were locked on the king, on the way his foot had struck her body, on the way her bones cracked. When she hit the ground, on the way he looked at her, as if she were nothing more than dust on the wind. She felt her rage rising like a fire in her chest. Her mother had told her once that the world would always try to break people like them, people who refused to bow, people who refused to close their eyes and pretend everything was fine. Her mother died because she refused to kneel when the first wave of scouts arrived years ago, and now it was happening again. And she was not going to let her mother's death mean nothing. She stood up even though her legs were trembling, even though the pain made her vision flicker. She grabbed a piece of broken metal from the ground and held it like a blade. She told the child to hide under the burnt remains of a car. She told him to close his eyes and cover his ears. She walked forward, each step echoing in the silence that followed the screams. The Galactic King turned his head slowly, his red eyes locking on her. She felt fear crawling up her spine, but she kept walking. The soldiers turned to face her, raising their weapons, but the king lifted a hand, and they stopped. The king stepped down from the rubble, Where he stood, his shadow stretching long across the broken street, he spoke words that buzzed in her skull. "You should have stayed down." She did not answer. She lifted the piece of metal higher, ready to swing, ready to fight, ready to die. If it meant she would not bow, she saw his eyes burn brighter, saw his foot lift from the ground, and she braced for the pain. But before it came, the sky above them cracked open again, and a sphere of blue light fell from the darkness, slamming into the ground between them with a sound like the world was splitting. And in that moment she remembered her father telling her about the old tunnels and the stolen tech, and she knew what she had to do. She did not wait to see the king's reaction. As the blue light pulsed around them, she turned and ran, limping through the smoke, her breath tearing at her throat. She found the child still hiding under the burnt car, his eyes wide with terror. She pulled him out and told him to stay quiet, to follow her, to keep his head down. They moved through the alleys littered with glass and ash, the sky still pulsing with purple lightning, as the king's soldiers moved in lines like shadows, searching for survivors to drag back to the throne. She knew she could not protect the child forever. She needed to find a place to hide, a place where the king's eyes could not see them. She remembered the tunnels her father had shown her when she was a child, the old subway lines beneath the city where he kept the pieces of alien tech he stole during the first invasion. He had told her if the sky ever fell again, she would find what she needed down there. She found a maintenance entrance hidden behind a rusted gate, and pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest. She lifted the child down into the darkness, then followed, closing the gate behind them. The air was damp and smelled of earth and mold. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the dark. She used the light from her cracked phone screen to guide them deeper into the tunnels, past old graffiti and broken tracks, past the silence of a world that had been forgotten. She found the door her father had shown her once, covered in rust, with a faded symbol painted in blue. She pressed her hand against it, remembering the code he had whispered to her. Like a prayer she spoke the words, and the door clicked open. The air inside was colder, the walls lined with shelves of strange devices glowing faintly with blue light. She told the child to sit in the corner, to stay still, to not be afraid. As she moved to the center of the room, where a sphere the size of her head sat on a pedestal, humming softly, she reached out. Her hand hesitated, remembering the way her father had lifted it once, with tears in his eyes, saying, "This will save you when I cannot." She closed her fingers around the sphere, and felt it come alive, heat pulsing through her arm, into her chest, into her bones. Visions flooded her mind, of stars burning, of ships tearing through the darkness, of the king's eyes watching entire worlds kneel before him. And she saw herself standing before him, not as she was now, broken and afraid, but with the blue light of the sphere in her hands, burning brighter than the king's red. She fell to her knees, the power of the sphere flooding her body, her mind screaming with the weight of memories, not her own. She saw the king's bloodline reaching back centuries, the cruelty, the conquest, the endless taking of worlds. She saw how they killed her mother, how they laughed as they left her father alone in the dark. She saw the future if she did nothing, and she made a choice. She stood up, holding the sphere to her chest as it fused with her skin, blue light cracking across her arms and down her neck, like veins of fire. She looked at the child and told him it was going to be okay. She was going to end it all. She was going to erase the Galactic King's bloodline forever. She felt the sphere pulsing against her chest, each beat of light sinking with her heart. The pain was sharp like needles under her skin, but she did not let go. She thought of her mother and her father, and the promise she made that she would never kneel, that she would never let them take everything from her. She looked at the child sitting in the corner, his eyes wide and scared, but there was hope in his gaze, a hope she could not let die. She told him to stay in the room, to keep the door locked, no matter what he heard outside. She told him she would come back. She would come back. When it was over, when the sky was blue again, when the screams had stopped, she turned and walked out of the room, the sphere now a part of her body, lines of blue fire running down her arms and across her collarbones, her hair lifting as if the air itself recognized the power inside her. She walked through the tunnels, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the fear she felt before replaced by something cold and clear. She climbed the rusted ladder to the surface, pushing open the grate to a city that was no longer hers. The streets were empty, burned cars and ash covering the ground, the air heavy with smoke and the scent of burned metal. She saw the king's soldiers moving in lines, rounding up the last of the people, dragging them toward the floating throne in the center of the city. She could see the Galactic King standing at the highest point of the rubble, watching with his red eyes, his crown spinning slowly above his head, as if nothing mattered, as if he was untouchable. She walked toward him, her steps leaving trails of blue light on the cracked pavement. The soldiers saw her and raised their weapons, but when they fired the bullets, and energy bolts turned to dust before they touched her, the blue light around her body humming as it swallowed the attacks. She lifted her hand and the soldiers fell to the ground one by one, their armor cracking under an invisible weight there, weapons shattering in their hands. She did not stop. She kept walking, her eyes locked on the Galactic King as he tilted his head, watching her with amusement as if she were an insect crawling toward a flame. She walked through the courtyard where the people were forced to kneel, and they looked up at her, their eyes wide with shock and hope as they saw the blue light shining in the smoke. As they saw her walking without fear, the Galactic King stepped down from the rubble, his cloak dragging across the ground as he moved toward her, his eyes burning brighter, the air around him rippling with heat. "You think you can challenge me?" he said, his voice like metal tearing, but she did not answer. She kept walking until they stood face to face, the sphere pulsing in her chest, the light humming in her veins. She saw his eyes narrow as he lifted his hand to strike her down, but before he could, she raised her own hand and the light exploded around them, turning the world into a storm of blue fire and crackling energy. The storm of blue fire surrounded them as the Galactic King tried to take a step back, but the ground beneath him cracked and sank under the weight of the light. She was no longer afraid as she moved forward, each breath steady as the energy of the sphere pulsed through her blood. The memories of those who had fought and died before her filled her mind, faces of men and women who refused to bow to the king's bloodline, who burned and screamed in the silence of space, who died with their fists clenched and eyes open. She saw them all and felt them all standing behind her as she took the final steps toward the king. His red eyes widened with something that looked like fear as the blue light reflected in the metal of his crown. He raised his hand and brought it down to crush her, but the light caught his hand and held it frozen in the air, like a statue cracking at the joints. She stepped closer until she could see her reflection in his burning eyes, until she could smell the smoke that clung to his armor, until she could hear the crackle of energy dancing across her skin, and she spoke for the first time since the light had entered her. She said, "This is for every world you have taken. This is for every child you have made watch their mothers die. This is for my mother. This is for my father." And the king roared, and the sound shook the glass in the broken buildings and rattled the bones of the people still kneeling in the courtyard. But she did not flinch. She lifted her hand and the light wrapped around his body, wrapping around the floating crown, tearing it from the air, the metal bending and twisting as the blue fire devoured it, piece by piece. The king tried to pull away, tried to use the power in his veins to fight back, but the light was inside him now, tearing through his bloodline, finding every mark of his power, every stolen memory, every command whispered across galaxies, and it burned them all. She felt the screams of his ancestors echo in her mind as the light spread across the universe like a silent promise. She saw distant planets where the king's bloodline had hidden children of the conquerors training in dark halls, dreaming of conquest. She saw them all, and the light saw them too, and one by one the light touched them, and they turned to ash. Without a sound, without a cry, without a word, the Galactic King fell to his knees in front of her, the red glow in his eyes flickering like a dying star as the light drained from his veins. She looked down at him and saw not a god but a monster afraid to die, a monster who had forgotten that even monsters can bleed. She reached out and touched his forehead with her glowing hand, and the blue light flared for a single breath before the king's body turned to dust that blew away on the wind, leaving nothing but silence, nothing but the promise that his bloodline was gone forever. The wind carried the ashes of the Galactic King into the empty sky as the blue light around her began to fade, leaving thin lines glowing along her skin like quiet rivers of fire. She stood there in the silence, the bodies of the king's soldiers scattered around her, some broken, some burned, and some still clutching their weapons as if they had died trying to understand how they could lose. She looked around at the people who had been forced to kneel, their faces lifting slowly, their eyes wide with the reflection of the dawn that was beginning to break through the smoke above them. Some of them began to cry, others simply stared as if they could not believe what they were seeing. She took a step back and felt the pain in her ribs, the reminder of the moment the king's boot had struck her body, the reminder that she was still human, that she could still bleed. She turned away from the place where the king had fallen and began to walk back through the courtyard, past the broken glass, past the silent weapons, past the eyes that followed her every step. She did not speak. As she moved, the blue light guiding her path back to the edge of the city, where the tunnels waited. She climbed down the rusted ladder and closed the grate behind her, the sound of the metal scraping against metal echoing in the dark as she made her way through the tunnels. The child was still there, sitting in the corner of the room where she had left him. his small arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes lifting when he saw her, the fear in them breaking into relief. She knelt down in front of him, ignoring the pain that flared in her chest as she placed her hand on his head, and told him it was over. The bad man was gone, and he was safe now. She promised him that the sky would be safe again, that he would not have to run or hide or watch people die in the street. She promised him that he would grow up in a world where no one would ever kneel to monsters again. She did not know if the world would keep that promise, but she knew she would. She helped him to his feet, and they left the tunnels together, climbing back into the morning light, where the smoke was clearing, and the air smelled like rain. For the first time in months, she saw people gathering in the streets, helping each other, lifting the wounded, carrying water, covering the dead with blankets. There was no screaming now, only the quiet sounds of people breathing, of people living. She stood there in the middle of the street, the child holding her hand as the wind moved through her hair and the sun broke through the last of the clouds. She could feel this fear still inside her, still alive but calm now, as if it was watching, waiting for what she would choose. Next she looked at the sky, remembering the promise she made to her mother, that she would protect what was left of their broken world, and she knew it was not finished, it was only beginning. She could feel the eyes of the people as she walked through the broken streets, holding the child's small hand in hers. The blue light still pulsing softly beneath her skin, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. She saw the way people moved aside as she passed, some of them whispering words she could not hear, some of them dropping their eyes, as if afraid to meet her gaze, others lifting their heads with something like hope burning in their tired faces. She saw them all, and she felt the weight of what she had done, the weight of what she had become. She found a place to sit beneath the broken sign of a store that had once sold food, before the shelves were emptied and the windows were smashed. She let the child sit beside her, his head resting against her arm as he closed his eyes, the exhaustion pulling him down into a restless sleep. She looked at the sky above, the clouds breaking apart to reveal blue for the first time in so long. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the light of the sun warm her face, letting herself breathe, letting herself feel alive. But the sphere inside her pulsed again, and visions flashed behind her closed eyes, visions of other worlds, still burning under the rule of those who had followed the king's path, visions of ships drifting in the dark with children trapped in cages, visions of people kneeling on distant soil with fear in their eyes as they looked up at thrones that floated above them. She opened her eyes and knew the fight was not over. The king's bloodline was gone, but the empire he had built remained. The weapons, the prisons, the fear they had planted in every corner of the galaxy still alive, waiting for someone else to claim the empty throne. She looked down at the child sleeping beside her, and she made another promise. She would not let the throne be claimed again. She would not let monsters rise in the ashes of the old one. She stood up gently, lifting the child into her arms, and began to walk toward the edge of the city where the ships of the king had fallen from the sky like burning stars. She found one that was still intact, the metal still humming with energy, the glyphs on its surface flickering, as if the ship itself was confused without the king's will to guide it. She stepped inside, the cold air brushing against her skin, the lights in the hallway turning on, as if recognizing her. The sphere inside her pulsed again, and the ship responded. The doors closing behind her, the engines rumbling. Deep beneath the floor, she laid the child down on one of the padded benches, covering him with a thin blanket she found in the storage bay. She stood in the control room, the screens lighting up around her, showing the stars, waiting in the dark, showing the paths to the worlds where people were still chained. She placed her hand on the control panel, the blue light of the sphere flowing through her fingers into the ship. The engines roared to life, and she lifted her eyes to the sky. She would not stop, she would free them all. The ship lifted from the ground with a deep vibrating hum as the dust of the broken city swirled beneath it. People looked up, shielding their eyes as the light from the engines cut through the early morning sky. She kept her hand on the control panel, feeling the ship move with her thoughts, feeling the sphere inside her syncing with the engines, with the navigation systems, with the silent language of the stars. As they stretched out before her, she looked back at the child who was still sleeping, wrapped in the thin blanket, his small chest rising and falling, as if the chaos of the world could not reach him. Here she turned her eyes back to the stars, and let the ship carry them beyond the edge of the atmosphere into the cold black, where the remains of the king's fleet drifted like burned bones. In the void she moved past them, silent and unseen, guided by the light in her veins as she set the coordinates for the nearest world that still burned under the king's forgotten empire. The ship slipped into faster travel, the stars turning to lines of light as space bent around them, and she let herself remember Her mother's voice telling her stories of the stars, telling her that there was more to life than fear, telling her that there was always something worth fighting for. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the grief move through her like a cold wind. Then she opened them and felt the fire return to her veins. The ship dropped from faster travel above a world covered in metal, cities layered like scars on the surface, smoke rising from factories where people were forced to work under the watch of armored guards, wearing the symbol of the king's rule. She saw the fear in the streets. She saw the lines of prisoners being moved through gates. She saw children huddled in corners as drones floated overhead. She saw it all, and the light inside her burned brighter. She lowered the ship onto the roof of one of the factories, the metal groaning under the weight. As the engines powered down, she stood up, checking that the child was still sleeping safe in the corner of the ship. Before stepping out into the cold air of the world, the wind carried the scent of smoke and oil, the cries of people blending with the mechanical hum of the drones. She walked forward, the blue light pulsing around her as the guards lifted their weapons, shouting at her to stop, to get on her knees. To obey, she did not stop. She raised her hand and the weapons turned to dust, the drones falling from the sky like broken insects, the guards stepping back, eyes wide as they saw the light reflecting in their helmets. She spoke, and her voice was calm. She said, "You are free now. The king's rule is over." The people who heard her began to stand, those who had hidden in the shadows, those who had been afraid to lift their heads. They saw her standing there, alone with the blue light burning like a promise, and they began to believe that freedom was possible. She moved through the streets of the metal city, her footsteps silent as the blue light rippled around her like a second skin. The people followed her, their eyes reflecting the glow as they stepped out of the shadows, out of the factories, out of the cages where they had been kept for so long. She walked past the guards, who dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, not in worship but in relief that the fear was over, that the endless nights of screams and hunger and silence were breaking. Like the dawn, she walked to the center of the city, where the overseer tower rose into the gray sky, its walls covered in black symbols of the king's dead bloodline. She lifted her hand and the walls cracked, splitting open with blue fire. The gates fell inward and the people followed her into the halls, where the overseers sat on iron thrones, barking orders through speakers and screens. She walked past their guards who tried to stop her, but their weapons turned to ash, their armor melted from their bodies as they scrambled away. She stepped into the throne room, and saw the overseer, an old man with metal eyes and a thin mouth twisted with fear. As he watched her approach, she saw him reach for the device on his wrist, the device that would call reinforcements from the ships that still drifted in orbit. But before he could press it, she raised her hand and the device shattered, the pieces falling to the floor like rain. She looked at him, and she spoke. "Your king is dead, your bloodline is dead, your fear is dead now. You will see what it means to be free." And the overseer screamed as the blue light wrapped around him, lifting him from the throne. As his body turned to dust, the people watched as the throne cracked and fell into pieces, the metal turning to rust and blowing away on the cold wind. She turned to face them, the blue light still burning in her veins, and she saw the hope in their eyes, the fear that was fading, the strength that was waking. She spoke to them, all her voice calm and clear. "You will build a world without kings. You will build a world without cages. You will build a world where your children will never have to kneel." And they listened. They listened because they had seen her walk through fire and stand before monsters, and they believed. She walked back through the broken streets to the ship where the child was waking up, his eyes blinking in the soft light. She lifted him into her arms and he wrapped his arms around her neck, whispering, "Thank you." And she held him close for a moment, letting herself feel the weight of the promise she had made and kept. She stepped back into the ship and the engines roared to life, lifting them into the sky as the people below raised their hands, not in fear, but in promise. She looked at the stars ahead, knowing there were more worlds waiting for her, waiting for the blue light, waiting for the promise of freedom. She would not stop until they were all free.